Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 308, The Importance of Being Furnished, with Erica Lome and Tripp Evans. Hi, I'm Jake. This week, I'm talking about 4 decorators who helped revolutionize interior design as the new aesthetic movement brought beauty and artistic sensibility to homes that had previously been dedicated to reinforcing traditional morality. In the wake of Oscar Wilde's 1882 lecture tour focusing on the House Beautiful, outlandishly decorated bachelor households became an aspirational style that helped define American homes from the Gilded Age to the Jazz era. Charles Gibson, Ogden Codman, Charles Pendleton, and Henry Sleeper, and of course their homes in Boston's Back Bay, Gloucester, Lincoln, and Providence, are the subjects of an exhibit at the Eustace Estate in Milton. At the time, all 4 men would have been known as bachelor aesthetes, born into privileged families, but hiding their queerness to greater or lesser degrees in an era when it was still criminalized. In this interview, exhibit curators Tripp Evans and Erica Lome will tell us how these men took inspiration from their personal lives in decorating their own homes, and how they leveraged those lavish homes into careers in decorating, for everyone from robber barons to Hollywood stars. But before we talk about these 4 designers and the importance of being furnished, I just want to pause and say thank you to all the generous sponsors who make it possible for me to make Hub History. I love that I have an excuse to have conversations with smart people like Erica Lome and Tripp Evans, and to learn aspects of Boston history and architecture that I never knew before. I'd never have a chance to do stuff like this without the podcast, and I couldn't make the podcast without a little help from my sponsors. Whether you choose a one-time contribution on PayPal, or monthly support of $2, $5, or even $10 or more, your support goes to offset the expenses that go into making Hub History. Knowing that I can rely on my supporters means that I can invest in web hosting and security, podcast media hosting, AI tools, and online audio processing, even at a time when I'm carefully watching expenses while I try to find a job. To everyone who's already supporting the show, thank you. If you're not yet supporting the show and you'd like to start, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. I'm joined now by Tripp Evans and Erica Lome. Erica Lome is the curator at Historic New England, and Tripp Evans is a professor of art history at Wheaton College and the guest curator of The Importance of Being Furnished, which is now on view at Historic New England's Eustace Estate in Milton. Erica and Tripp, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are gathered here today to talk about an exhibit. I almost said a new exhibit, but it's been on view for a month or two now at the Eustace Estate in Milton, and it's called The Importance of Being Furnished. So just to set it up, it's an exhibit that focuses on 4 homes, 4 houses that were furnished by 4 designers and collectors in the decade sort of immediately surrounding the turn of the 20th century, into the 19th, beginning of the 20th. And it's 4 designers who might have been known as confirmed bachelors at the time. We probably think of them as gay today. Before we really get into their houses and their sort of design philosophies, can we talk for a minute about what it's like to research LGBTQ people in an era when homosexuality was a crime here in Massachusetts, punishable by imprisonment?
Well, it requires some real patience and sometimes some creativity in how you approach your subjects, because in some ways, no one wanted to sort of cover their tracks more so than the subjects themselves. So what we're faced with as researchers often of LGBTQ plus subjects from the late Gilded Age and early 20th century are really telling absences sometimes of private correspondence, of anything related to relationships. And for that reason, researchers sometimes have to approach topics obliquely. You have to approach topics through other subjects sometimes who may know more about your subject than your subject is telling you himself or herself. And I think sometimes just starting with a telling absence or a telling silence speaks volumes about what needs to be found within these. Because in the records of most heterosexual historical figures, it's not so hard to reconstruct people's private lives and relationships. But when you encounter folks who either were known to be gay within their own lifetime or suspected to be, I think that is one of the biggest red flags in the beginning, is that suddenly you may have all of their business correspondence, and it's as if they had no private lives at all. But it's not impossible to reconstruct. It just takes some patience.
That's interesting. It's almost the opposite of what historians are usually looking for. You're looking for the document, or you're looking for the letters, you're looking for account books, you're looking for any documents that they specifically created. And here it's almost you're looking for a black hole where the documents should be. There's no love letter, there's no private journal, there's no private life revealed at all in some ways.
Yeah, the metaphor I always use, those bodies that they reconstruct from Pompeii, where the body has disappeared, but like the cavity where the body once existed still is. So it's the historian's job, I think, in some of these cases, to be the one who pumps the cement into that cavity. The cavity is there. The life, didn't disappear. It's just that you've got to use detective skills and other sources in order to recreate that void. But the void itself is still there, and I think very telling.
I'm sure for some folks there is chatter from other people speculating about the private lives of somebody you might research. I'm sure it's hard to know how much weight to give to something like that versus the photographic negative of a private life that's missing from the record.
The chatter can be very important. I mean, as Erica knows, the Codman family manuscript collection at Historic New England is vast, almost so vast as to be kind of paralyzing for a researcher. But to give you a specific example from this project, one of my subjects, Charlie Gibson, for 100 plus years, rumors had swirled around his same-sex relationships. There's no evidence of it within his personal archive. But if you go to the Codman archive, who lived at the same time period and sort of swam in the same circles, suddenly you find letters between Ogden Codman and his colleagues, or Ogden Codman and his mother, that give us, everything we need to know about what Charlie Gibson was up to. And that provides, I think, very useful evidence. From a curatorial's perspective, because this was a challenge for us, how do you make that kind of evidence feel material and kind of alive for viewers?
Well, I was thinking as you were talking, Tripp, about how we operate 38 house museums. And the philosophy of Historic New England from the start has been to make those homes feel as authentic as possible, for our visitors to walk in and say to themselves, oh, I could see myself living here, or I feel that people lived here once. And the irony is we can create those spaces and we can interpret those spaces, but the subjects themselves, the previous owners, can still be a mystery to us. And for to have these private spaces and still feel as though you don't understand the private lives of their occupants is, I think, the challenge and goal of interpretation, to bridge that gap. And I think what the exhibition succeeds at doing is combining the material lives of these men, the interiors that they sunk their money, their passions, their experiences into, and then connecting that with the archival material, the letters, the ephemera, the photography, and trying to reconstruct a way of thinking, a way of living that to our modern eyes, we could assign a letter on the alphabet. But for these men who, lived in a different time, they might not have regarded themselves as such, or they might have bristled by anyone calling them gay or calling them straight, or, however the terminology we want to use. So it's trying to be as transparent as possible with what we know and what we don't know, and leaving the in-between to not necessarily speculation, but to allow the visitor to sit in that space and think about their own experiences and relate it to the experiences of these men and try to create that connection. So it's difficult as a curator. You don't want to shove answers down anyone's throats. There's stuff that we believe, Tripp especially as the expert and the biographer of these men's lives, but we're not necessarily going to tell visitors this person was this way, but we can present an accumulation of stories, of objects, of letters, of perspectives, and then persuade folks to sort of think differently about a subject that they thought they knew or didn't know anything about.
And I think one of the easiest ways to do that, and the thing that we've tried to do organically with this show, is just as you say, Erica, rather than speaking in terms of broad categories, say the lived experience for this man was that he was in love with this other man, and had this great relationship with this person. I think that gets closer in some ways to capturing the texture of what their lives felt like for them. They may not have imagined themselves as part of a larger kind of queer community. I think that's probably not the case. But certainly for them, the truth of their lives was that for the majority of the 4 subjects that I cover in the book and the exhibition, their lives were primarily connected to same-sex relationships that they would have recognized in terms of the individual rather than a category, probably.
While these men may not have left documents to examine, they did leave behind the houses that are the subjects of the exhibit, the importance of being furnished. Just to sort of lay the groundwork before we talk about the specifics of each of the homes and each of the men's lives, this is a period, again, sort of spanning a couple of decades on either side of the turn of the century when the aesthetic movement was becoming predominant in, I guess, art and architecture. Mm-hmm. For listeners who, like me, aren't super familiar with this era of decorating and architecture, what was the aesthetic movement? How is it different from sort of preceding trends?
If I had to put it in a nutshell, the aesthetic movement is a visual arts-based movement that begins in England and spreads to the United States and elsewhere in the late 19th century. And the radical kind of platform of the aesthetic movement, as espoused by people like Oscar Wilde, James McNeill Whistler, and others, was that art needed to be removed from having any sense of a kind of moral mission. Victorian notions of the purpose of art was that it was didactic in nature. It was always meant to have a kind of an underlying moral purpose. And their radical notion was that art was for art's sake. That was their motto. And the idea was that art existed only for a sense of beauty alone. And that led to the equally radical notion for, say, the American home or, domestic decoration, which was a big part of the aesthetic movement, that the home itself had no moral purpose, that the home's decoration was about a reflection of a visual agenda that could be that of a family. It could be that of a married couple. But for Oscar Wilde, as you might imagine, ideally, it was the vision of a single person, a unified artistic vision. And that's what led into this radical idea that a bachelor could actually create a home that was worthy of emulation. Because prior to the 1880s, the very notion of the home, in the absence of marriage or family, or say the inculcation of Christian virtue, just didn't even make any sense to anyone. Our modern notion that our homes are supposed to reflect our individual taste, which feels so natural to us now, was a really unnatural idea in the late 19th century. And we can thank the aesthetic movement for it. Their whole notion was that homes are really just about visual vehicles for expressing personality.
Well, speaking of Oscar Wilde as one of the people who popularized this new idea, I read at the exhibit that he gave 2 talks on the House Beautiful in Boston or around Boston. Do we know if any of the designers who are profiled in the exhibit actually attended one of his talks, or do we know what their entry point into this movement would have been?
Well, we don't have strict evidence that there was a direct link between these talks and the older of the groups. Charles Pendleton and Ogden Codman would have really been the only 2 of the 4 that would have been old enough probably to attend these lectures. But Codman does mention quite a bit about Oscar Wilde. He is connected to the aesthetic movement as an early designer, even in his late teens. But what's more important in some ways is that Oscar Wilde kind of reshaped or reframed the world that all 4 of these men inherited. So he hangs over this project kind of like a patron saint, even if we can't imagine them physically in the seats in those lecture rooms. Because I think you cannot underestimate the impact and the power that that lecture series and that the movement itself had on the ways that people thought about American interior decoration generally.
He provides a sort of thematic umbrella for understanding this exhibition and the ways that each of these four men had very different design aesthetics, but they were united by this sort of shared goal of creating homes that reflected their own unique individual tastes. And that is something that you can make a direct connection to Wilde's theories and philosophies of beauty and art.
That's one of the reasons why I think it was very useful for me to choose four subjects who were from the same region, the same class, the same time period, roughly the same kind of calling professionally. Because one would expect them to have all created kind of a cookie cutter kind of similar environment to one another. Certainly you see that, say, in Gilded Age Newport. Every one of those houses starts to look exactly the same from that period. But these four guys, you cannot imagine four environments more different than each other. And that's quite surprising, given the fact that they were from virtually the same mold. And it's precisely due to that aesthetic movement call to reflect your own individual personality.
Just to give a concrete example, one of the things that appeals to me about Beauport as a house and as a case study. So Beauport, the Sleeper McCann house in Gloucester, Massachusetts, was the home of Henry Davis Sleeper, one of the subjects in the exhibition. And Sleeper was such a fascinating person. His design aesthetic drew from many different sources. He was a collector. He thought about color and tone and mood and theme in his rooms. He collected and decorated with a lot of antiques, but he was not necessarily a faithful colonial revivalist or preservationist, but he saw history and antiques as inspiration. But when he was decorating and building his house and, in successive phases of construction, he built dining rooms, he built bedrooms, he built spaces for entertaining his close circle of friends on Cape Ann, but he did not build family rooms. And it wasn't until he passed away and the McCann family took ownership of the house, and they were advised to keep the house entirely the same, to preserve Sleeper's vision as faithfully as possible, with one exception. They transformed what Sleeper had constructed as the sort of China trade room, this elaborate chinoiserie fantasy space, and they turned it into a family parlor, a drawing room for their home, for their children. And that is sort of the one exception in the house where we can see the sort of functions of family play a role in how the space looked. And that seems to me the most telling example of an individual who was not building or decorating his home towards a sort of domestic ideal of family life, but towards his own pleasures and whims and, his own circle of friends and, no one else. So that is, I think, the most concrete example of how these spaces reflected the non-traditional or non-normative lifestyles and aspects of these subjects.
Let's stay focused on Henry Sleeper and Beauport for a minute then. Beauport is a home, an estate, I guess, in Gloucester, up on Cape Ann, and specifically in an area of Gloucester known as Eastern Point. I had the opportunity to wander through the exhibit last week and read some of the interpretive material, and it says that he was drawn to the site. He was sort of driven to keep expanding and improving the home and adding to it and redecorating it by his obsession with one of his neighbors. I'm not sure the pronunciation. It might be Piatt Andrew, or maybe Piatt Andrew. Piatt. Who was Piatt Andrew?
First, I want to thank you, Erica, for the whole point about no family rooms at Beauport. All the years I've been working on this, that never occurred to me, but that's I think, a brilliant way to think about the difference between the bachelor owner and subsequent ownership. The story of Henry Davis Sleeper and Piatt Andrew is one that I believe is really at the center of the creation of Beauport. So what happens is that in April of 1906, Piatt Andrew, who was this incredibly handsome and charismatic and brilliant Harvard economist, was seated at a dinner party next to Henry Davis Sleeper. They'd never met before. Piatt Andrew invites Sleeper subsequently to visit him at his home on Eastern Point called Red Roof later that month. And really, for Henry Davis Sleeper, there was no looking back. He was head over heels in love with Piatt Andrew, as just about everyone who met Piatt Andrew was, and really lost no time buying the property as close as he could get to Red Roof, thereby sort of cementing his presence on Eastern Point. It's my belief that this romantic passion was probably a one-way street between Sleeper and Pied Andrew. Pied Andrew conducted really only same-sex affairs throughout his life, but Sleeper appears not to have really been his type. But they remained very close friends, and as the development of Beauport kind of unfolded over the decades, I really do believe that its articulation had so much to do with Sleeper's fascination with Pied Andrew and his wish to maintain his attention. In the book, I call Beauport an architectural geisha performance. It's kind of this elaborate visual strategy to keep Pied Andrew interested.
In the exhibit, there are some objects from the 1921 Octagon Room and then some photos and views into what the Octagon Room looks like at Beauport. The whole thing's furnished in red. There's a red railway signal lamp. There's a taxidermied scarlet ibis. There's a knife box that was a gift from Isabella Stewart Gardner. There's all this oversaturation of red, and it's referred to as Sleeper's greatest love letter to Pied Andrew. Why did he think that the room or the house or the architecture essentially was how he was going to keep Andrew's attention?
That house at Beauport, since its construction in the 1920s, has almost always been singled out as kind of the jewel in a very studied crown. It is seen as sort of the highlight of his practice as an interior decorator. But the way that people have talked about the Octagon or Souvenir de France room, it goes kind of by two names, was this concentration on its red color palette. Now, critics from the 1920s forward have pointed to this beautiful color harmony, and even the name of the room, the Souvenir de France room, while scratching their heads thinking, we're not quite sure how he came up with all of this. And to me, all the evidence has always been there that this is a room that is almost kind of like a shrine to the owner of Red Roof. Pied Andrew was associated with the color red not just because of his house, but certainly in a central way it was. But he was born a couple of days before Valentine's Day. Friends competed with one another to make kind of inside jokes about the color red. They would write to him in red ink. They would use red, writing paper. At one point, Sleeper said, the time without you, Pied Andrew, is so boring, but I have to remember that thousands of years of compression create not diamonds, but rubies. So there was always this sense that red was his color. And significantly, by calling it the Souvenir de France room, he was recalling not, say, some general notion of like Franco-American relations, as the Beauport's guidebook in the 1950s, insisted. But instead, he was recalling the 1 year that Pied Andrew and Sleeper shared together in Paris during World War I. In fact, much of the collection in that room came from that year when they were together in Paris for the war effort, in 1917 to 1918. The shape of the room, even the octagonal shape of its, space, refers to a kind of folk art artifact that Sleeper collected called a sailor's valentine. He collected these. He gave one to Pied Andrew. They are octagonal shellcraft creations that were supposed to be something that a sailor would give to his sweetheart when he came home from a voyage.
I saw at least one of those in the exhibit, and then a carved wooden witch, several folk art elements that seem to be mixed right alongside high-end English porcelain, Japanese housewares. So it wasn't all one style by any means. What does that sort of conglomeration mean?
Two things. He mixed high and low an awful lot. So really valuable things next to kind of almost throwaway items. He was really attentive to the ways in which an object can inform a room. He almost always started with an object first and then let the object tell him what the room needed to be. So when I say that, that dining room is an elaborate sailor's valentine, it makes sense from his perspective that you would start with something small that gives you an idea, a germ, for a larger space. And Erica, as a curator, you can probably speak, more eloquently than I can to his collection. I mean, it really is a range, isn't it?
It's an eclectic collection. And as I mentioned, he was not a devotee necessarily of the colonial revival. There were a lot of his peers and contemporaries who were collecting Americana with the broader goal of telling a story of American exceptionalism and connoisseurship, who were concerned with an object's provenance and its quality. Sure, Sleeper was concerned with those things too, but for him, it was really about the ability of an object to tell a design story within the room. So he had no qualms about painting over a Windsor chair to help it match the sort of seafoam green aesthetic of a space, or to, when he could not find the exact historic style he was looking for, he had his carpenter create something that looked historic but had no direct historical precedence. So he could do that in a room, but also have incredible antiques of exceptional rarity. And that is why you could spend a week just looking at one room, peeling back the different layers. And every time you re-enter that space, you'd notice something different. I think that's why our visitors enjoy coming back time after time, because he delighted in whimsy. He delighted in creating moments, encounters between human and object, human and space, and it rewards repeated viewing and close looking. And I think that's what sets him apart from his peers who might have had more traditional aims of collecting and decorating.
I have to say, one of my favorite objects that's on display right now stands almost exactly in opposition to that idea that he wasn't really collecting Americana and trying to create this idea of American exceptionalism, because over the mantle in the sleeper room is a white flag emblazoned with the pine tree, the motto, "We appeal to heaven." It's at least in the style of the flags that flew on some of the first American ships in the Revolutionary War. Is that an original from that era?
It could very likely be an original from that era. The trick of Beauport is that Sleeper did not keep a lot of records about where he acquired his objects, and he destroyed a lot of his records right before his death, or a lot of records were destroyed after his death. However, he was very attentive to history and to Americana in particular, but he always collected and decorated with sort of a wink to the audience. And Tripp has a wonderful way of saying this. I'll try to paraphrase there. When you encounter that banner in the book tower room at Beauport, it's a two-story room that is very vertically oriented. And the banner hangs down from the second story balcony. And it's almost a joke. We appeal to heaven. You're looking up heavenwards to regard this banner. And sure, I think he enjoyed the historical significance of it. He enjoyed the way it conjured up associations with other parts of the house, where you have George Washington's face appears like a little scavenger hunt throughout the house. Ben Franklin appears throughout the house. He was certainly enamored with the iconography of the founding fathers and of that era, but I don't think he was necessarily collecting in order to preserve history in that sense, the way that many of his peers were.
I loved seeing it there because lately that flag has become associated with sort of right-wing movements. It was just in the press because Justice Alito was flying it in sort of a protest move after January 6th. So I wonder how he would take the news of how it was displayed at Beauport.
What's fascinating is that even in the 18th century context, it was already a symbol that had been appropriated, right? The pine tree symbol was an indigenous symbol of peace, and it was used by the indigenous forces and then co-opted by Washington and his, associates, and then has this sort of second life in the 19th century as this revival of patriotism. And obviously Sleeper might have known about some of these associations. Maybe he knew and disregarded them, or maybe for him it was more of like how it looked in the house suited him. And it has continued to transform and take on new meaning in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so it will be interesting to see in the future what visitors associate with that flag and with that symbol when they come to Beauport. And it's going to remain at Beauport because it kind of gets folded into this larger conversation about history and how we encounter the past. It changes every day. But Sleeper's vision remains in some ways frozen in time, and not necessarily static, but when you go into that house, it is exactly as it was when he lived there and was decorating it.
And you know what? We selected that flag for the exhibition long before it was so visibly adopted by the right. And at first I was a little horrified by wondering if people thought historic New England was going to be making some kind of political symbol, signaling with this. But in another way, I'm really kind of glad that we used it because I feel like it allows us to reclaim this as sleepers and to reclaim it as something that is, in its own way, a kind of winking and I even think kind of a campy sensibility of like using American history in ways that are, kind of revealing their sense of humor. I find that entire book tower kind of hilarious. So it was built right after, or not long after, Piatt Andrew created his own library at Red Roof. And you can almost see Sleeper saying, look, I'm into books too. I love books. And he created this bonkers library. I mean, who creates a round library to begin with? Like, it doesn't even make sense with the way that you display the books. It is tiny and compressed and so just almost just symbolic of a library than really being a library itself. And then he flies his pennant at the very end saying, we appeal to heaven. And he was appealing to heaven for all kinds of reasons with that library.
Beauport had to be more than, his own space and an appeal to Piatt Andrew. Sleeper was a working decorator, so it was also a calling card, a showroom. How did he use his house and press coverage of his house to further his career?
I kind of part company in some ways with what has become kind of a traditional interpretation of Beauport, where people talk about its many eclectic themed rooms as kind of a catalog or a showcase for him to use as a professional interior decorator. The problem that I have with that theory is that he really doesn't hang up his shingle in a professional sense until most of those rooms were already completed. So, many of them were already in place before he becomes a kind of high profile decorator. Certainly he'd been decorating for friends and others on Cape Ann kind of informally for many years. So certainly clients were able to see, in the 1920s and early 1930s, his kind of look. But it was such an unusual blend of ideas and objects that in many ways, I feel like as a professional interior decorator, he never pulled off for clients what he was able to do for himself. I think they didn't have kind of the courage to pull off the kinds of things that he did. Having said that, it really is those rooms, though, that gets the attention of people like architect Arthur Little, who right after Beauport was completed, he writes Sleeper and says, you've got to do this professionally. I mean, people would kill for this kind of eye or these kinds of rooms. And he's quite flattered by it and really sort of encouraged. And true to form, what does he do as soon as he gets that compliment is he writes a letter to Piatt Andrew and says, can you believe someone thinks that I'm good enough to be a professional interior decorator when in fact, all of the pains I took here were because of you. And he says explicitly at one point, Beauport would not have existed but for you. So it's not to say that his kind of unrequited passion for Piatt Andrew is the sole driving factor of Beauport. That's not mutually exclusive with other interpretations of those rooms. He certainly does become quite a successful professional interior decorator. I think I approach with caution the idea that the house itself is a catalog meant for clients, because I think most conservative clients would look at some of those rooms and, run for the hills. They might think that's great for you, but I can't pull that off.
And Sleeper does end up designing for celebrities like Joan Crawford. He does some work for the Vanderbilts. And that might be a transition to talk about another one of the subjects of the exhibit, who also ended up doing some work for the Vanderbilts at one point. If you don't mind, can we shift gears and talk about Ogden Codman Jr. a little bit?
Yeah.
I'll admit that only one of these men had I ever met in the archives or anywhere before getting ready for this interview and going to the Eustis Estate to see the exhibit. So I was greeted walking into the room that serves as Ogden Codman's with two giant John Singleton Copley portraits. There's a John Codman III, and then there's some of the Ogden has come to refer to as Bad Uncle Richard.
Right.
So can we start with who Bad Uncle Richard would have been, or who these portraits are of, and then how Ogden Jr. came to, I guess, identify with his bad uncle?
From a purely curatorial perspective, I was so excited to finally put these two Copley portraits together as pendant portraits. They both hang at the Codman Estate today, but in different rooms. And so the two brothers, painted within a couple of years of one another, have never kind of faced off in terms of their portraits. The reason why I wanted those at the center of the Codman Gallery, which is entitled Double Vision at the Codman Estate, was to give a kind of graphic representation of the two poles that really define Codman's life. So Ogden Codman Jr. revered and really worshipped these two ancestors. One was his great-great-grandfather, John Codman III, and the other was Richard Codman, who was his great-great-uncle. You cannot imagine two brothers more different than these two. And yet, the DNA of their personalities really sort of combines within Ogden Codman Jr. John Codman III was an incredibly successful businessman. He was a family guy. He was religious. He was home-loving. Everything that you would expect of a good conservative patrician Yankee. Richard Codman was dashingly handsome, a bachelor. He goes into business partnership with his brother, which was one of the dumbest business decisions his brother ever made. He sends Richard over to revolutionary France in the 1790s to establish trade ties with the revolutionary government. Instead, Richard gets over there and his first notion is, French chateaux are so cheap right now. Like nobody seems to be living in them. So he picks up 1, 2, 3, 4, ultimately almost 5 different chateaux in and around Paris. He is liquidating the family's, company stock basically to pay for these. He's installed his mistress at one of them. He is living this incredible expatriate life of excess and kind of francophilia. Those two strains, the good patrician conservative Yankee on the one side and the dashing, flashy expatriate, ancien regime, sexual libertine side of the family really do come together in Codman's person as well as in his decorating. I mean, his decorating style was very much a combination of New England meets sort of continental excess. And certainly within his life too, that was true. One of the cases in that gallery that I think has garnered more attention than most is pointing to the fact that all the while the Codman is collecting historic kind of academic images of chateaux in the late 1890s, he's also putting together a pretty sizable pornography collection. And so, I nod to that in the exhibition only to show, again, that notion of excess and propriety sort of standing side by side, that you can take all the way back to his ancestors, but it goes forward into his own time period.
I guess there are at least 2 periods in Ogden Jr.'s life when he lives in France for kind of extended periods. And the first one, I think, is when he's a kid or maybe an adolescent. And it's indirectly, at least, a result of his father, Ogden Sr.'s investment in Boston insurance companies. How did Ogden Sr.'s investments, in a way, end up leading to Ogden Jr.'s obsession with France?
Ogden Sr. had reclaimed the family house, the Codman estate, that had been sold out of the family by his father. So there was a little period that Codman Jr. called the interregnum between Codman ownership. So his father, like much of the Codman family, were heavily invested in the insurance industry. So when the Great Boston Fire of 1872 happened, the insurance industry collapsed, along with, many of their downtown investments. So the Codman family, in order to retrench and rebuild their finances, end up in the mid-1870s, renting out the estate and then moving to France. France was a very cheap place to live after the Franco-Prussian War. They were able to go over there and sort of live relatively in the style to which they were accustomed while saving a lot of money. So Codman really, from the age of 10 to 18, is away from the family home and in fact never comes back to live at the family home permanently. It becomes kind of like a mirage for him of the place where his family had, ended their first kind of golden era. Later in life, really beginning in the 19-teens and then starting permanently in 1920, he's an expat permanently. I mean, between 1920 and his death in 1951, he's living abroad. I mean, his only connection to the family house, and it was still a strong one, was letters back home to his siblings insisting on furniture finishes, upholstery, floor wax, demands that they go to Aunt Fanny's estate sale and grab as much furniture as they can. He's not only insistent, but he's also insisting that they send him Kodaks as proof Kodak images that they have carried out his wishes. But that French taste that runs throughout really all the generations of the Codmans, becomes real when we're talking about Codman himself, who for, I would say, almost the majority of his life spent in France.
That's an interesting point to pause and look at that family home. So the one that his father repurchased after it had been sort of sold away, it was already an old home by the time Ogden is growing up in it. It's a 1740s, I want to say, estate in Lincoln, Mass.
Yes, it's this incredible English-style home plopped onto the hills of rural Middlesex County at a time when I think nothing else in the county looked like that. And that kind of establishes the reputation going forward of both the house and the family as being slightly elevated and above everyone else, and very tightly constrained and insular too. I mean, it's a family home as we interpret it. Several generations lived there, not all consecutively, but the Codman family story and that house are so deeply intertwined that when you walk in, you can feel the weight of that history and that wonderful layered effect room to room, and with all the subsequent additions that were made, but also, objects from the 18th century, 19th century to early 20th century. That house is so full of stuff. We like to joke. They never threw anything out, which is the opportunity and challenge of the curator.
Building on something you said, Tripp, that a lot of what we know about the house is from Ogden's letters home to his siblings. It was interesting to learn that, he was, I think, the oldest of 6.
Right.
And he was the only one as an adult who lived outside that family home in Lincoln. The other 5 siblings basically lived out their adulthoods without marrying, without working, and without really leaving home.
Yeah, so there were 6 in all, though one brother died in infancy. So there were 4 unmarried siblings living back at the estate. There were periods in which sometimes the siblings would have like a pied-à-terre in Boston, but primarily as adults, his 2 sisters and his 2 brothers really were centered in Lincoln. And part of that had to do with the very, very strong personality of their mother. Ogden Codman Jr. really does appear to be the lone sibling that was allowed to work for a living, who was kind of allowed to escape the confines of the family and the estate. And that's partly because of the very special relationship that Ogden Codman Jr. had with his mother. His father was largely absent from the picture for the last decades of his parents' marriage. And Codman in some ways kind of stepped in as a kind of a surrogate spouse and father to his, in some cases, much younger siblings. So well into their 40s and even into their 50s, the siblings were on allowances. They were essentially barred from any kind of profession. It was Mrs. Codman's preference that they stayed close to home. And it did lead to this kind of Grey Gardens effect of these unmarried siblings kind of rattling around this house. And to give you a sense of the span of that generation, which is just incredible to me, if you go from the birth of Ogden Codman to the death of his youngest sister, you're talking about a span from the Battle of Gettysburg to the Beatles' White Album. I mean, that is one generation, and very little changed. Erica's absolutely right that the house, when you go inside it, is this, there are these almost archaeological layers of 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. But what is fascinating to me are the ways in which the Codmans kind of insisted that nothing could change, that time sort of stopped at the house. And in fact, even in periods when John Codman III or Ogden Codman Sr. or Ogden Codman Jr. are significantly expanding or altering the house, they do so in ways that are kind of retro. They evoke earlier periods. So it's almost as if their expansions are intended to kind of time travel back to say the house was always bigger than people realized. The house was always grander than people realized. And to do that, they would rely on earlier styles so that when people showed up, they would think, oh, it was ever thus. In fact, it was this incredibly kind of dynamic process of retreating into time. And in fact, if Ogden Codman Jr. had gotten his druthers, he had planned a really drastic colonial revival makeover of a colonial house that would have significantly changed its appearance, but again, would have made it look as if it had been a much grander 18th century house than it ever was in the 1740s.
I think you're kind of keying in on such a wonderful connective tissue between all four subjects. Is their homes were sort of all based on illusion and memory and nostalgia and playing around with time. It's so fascinating to continue to think about how these ideas come out even after we've installed the show.
There's this illusion of things being frozen in time, but you can tell that they aren't from two chairs that are being displayed right next to each other in the exhibit. And one's labeled as being bought in 1882. Ogden's a teenager. He's collecting the sort of English arts and crafts style. And then right next to it is a French chair that he installed in the home, or asked, I guess, demanded to be installed in the home in 1898. Well, what's that, 16, 17 years later? What does it tell us by seeing these two pieces next to each other about Codman's evolution or journey as a designer from sort of a teen years into his middle ages?
Well, one of the things we wanted to do in all four of the galleries to bring a through line to this show was to use chairs in particular to sort of tell stories. And those can be stories about stylistic evolution. They are sometimes stories about relationships with family members or, you name it. But the chairs are one of the through lines. In the Codman Gallery, the juxtaposition of those two chairs is in some ways to shake up I think the public perception of who Ogden Codman Jr. was as a designer. He's easily the best known of all four men in terms of his design practice. And he's always associated with this kind of Gilded Age, Louis XVI French style, which is really typical of that Louis XVI chair that's in that gallery. The reason why we put the 1880s William Morris chair next to it is to show that early on, as a late teenager and in his early 20s, he's really fascinated with the English arts and crafts movement, which almost nobody would have expected in some ways. The English arts and crafts movement was moralizing. It was cozy. It was not about grandeur or display. It was about hand craftsmanship. None of these are things that you associate with the mature style of Ogden Codman, who was all about flash and a kind of aristocratic sensibility, which has nothing to do with William Morris. And so we put those two together partly to show the evolution of a very young designer to a mature designer, and to highlight the fact that, his career did have an evolutionary and kind of dynamic change.
I think one of the essential collaborations for him was with Edith Wharton. Together, they wrote The Decoration of Houses in 1897. And this was very much a treatise about what they considered to be good design, very classically inspired. It was a rebuttal against Victorian excess. It was a roadmap for how to bring harmony, proportion into the home. Again, it's the way that the home can reflect the ideals of the owner, but also inculcate good behavior and habits in the owner as well. If you decorate your home accordingly, not necessarily in a moral way, but in a way where a beautiful home creates a beautiful person. And they had some disagreements. They were two strong-willed personalities, and especially in the construction of Wharton's own home in Lenox, Massachusetts. I think that was one of those projects that ultimately drove a wedge between them. They could not settle on the other's vision. But it was one of those moments in his career. I think he was a young man when Decoration of Houses was published, where you could see his design priorities kind of settle into place. And I think that helps inform the trajectory of his career after that.
Expand on that if you don't mind. What does this book that he co-writes with Edith Wharton, what's that mean for his career? Because I know up until that point he had maybe done some professional design. He had designed at home. He'd had some training as an architect. So I know his architectural drawings are on display. But is that book really what catapults him into sort of the public eye as a designer?
I would say two things about that. I think that book, which was extraordinarily popular when it first came out and has never gone out of print, I feel like the book has cemented his legacy, kind of long term. I think that's what people think of when they think about, who Ogden Codman was as a designer. I don't know necessarily that his authorship of that book was what was bringing clients to his door. I think in some ways it was more, if we think about the cause and effect, it's almost the clients were driving the popularity of the book because everyone knew how well connected he was. So for the Vanderbilts and Astors and others that he's designing for, they really wanted the aristocratic kind of stagecraft that he was selling. And that's really at the center of that book. It's interesting when you read The Decoration of Houses today, you almost kind of wonder how it was as big a bestseller as it was, because it seems to be speaking to a very small portion of the one percenters. It is talking about ballrooms and staircases and proportions of houses that were wildly outside the economy of really any American reader.
The commissions he's getting are for places like the Breakers, like the big Newport
Absolutely.
mansions, right?
And, Wharton, who we think probably was more responsible for much of the text than Codman. Codman was really doing a lot of the research around the chateau. Wharton said at one point, if the rich man gets good design, then everyone else will too. There was this sort of notion that there was a trickle-down idea that if the ballrooms are done perfectly at this guy's house, then eventually the parlor of a middle-class person will reflect that sort of trickle-down taste. But what is so interesting to me, and what we tried again to sort of reflect, I did in the book and in the gallery, is that all the while that he and Edith Wharton are writing this frosty treatise on architectural decorum and the proper way to create spaces in which, you can behave as a lady or a gentleman. I mean, everything that you associated with sort of stiff Gilded Age manners. This is exactly the time period when you look at Codman's letters that he is carousing Boston, Paris, Rome. He's collecting porn. He's going to gay bars in New York. He's writing his best friend Arthur Little about the best, kind of cruising spots in different, countries. I often point out this excess versus propriety. To me, it is never starker than when he's writing this rules manual about how to live like a gentleman in a house on the one hand. On the other hand, he's acting in a manner that certainly for his time would have a baseline been illegal. And in terms of if there had been broader knowledge of his activities, I don't think he ever would have been the success that he was.
That's why it comes as such a surprise in one of the last panels in that part of the exhibit to learn that on top of this, exuberant lifestyle on multiple continents that he's living, then he gets married in 1904.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
So when he marries in 1904 to Lila Griswold Webb, who was a very, very wealthy widow and a client of his and several years his senior, everyone in New York knew exactly who Ogden Codman was and what circles he ran in. So that the headlines did not read necessarily, Mrs. Webb to marry again. But there was one New York Times headline that simply ran New York Society Astonished, period. Because everyone sort of knew what the story was. And I have every reason to believe that Lila Griswold Webb herself knew the real score about the husband she was marrying. What you learn from their letters with one another and from his letters to others about Lila is that it was, I think, a profound love match in the sense that they had really sort of profound shared interests in decorating, chateau research, shopping, and traveling. In fact, when she dies in 1910, many of the condolence letters that were written to Ogden Codman Jr. were from friends who said, "I'm so sorry about Lila. I remember how much you loved shopping with her and antiquing with her." And there's no sense that this is a romantic relationship in any sense. But I do think, I don't want to dismiss Lila as a kind of a joke or just a beard. I do think that she was a profoundly important person to him in some ways. And certainly financially, she became a really important person to him because her estate effectively fuels the rest of his life. He stops being a professional interior decorator and he can just start building houses for himself.
Shifting gears to another one of our designers, if everybody in New York knew who Ogden was at the time that he married Lila, Charles Pendleton was very different. He seems almost like an enigma in trying to get a read on him, at least through what's presented in the exhibit, which points out that there's basically no documentation in his personal life after the 1860s when he was still a very young adult. The only surviving photo that's reproduced in the exhibit is taken when he's just 15 years old. And yet today his home's recreated as a museum at RISD. So who was this guy, Charles Pendleton, to deserve a museum at RISD?
That is a very thorny question, and it is one that is that I think we wrestled with in terms of how to tell the story in this show. So, in a nutshell, Charles Pendleton was born to a wealthy farming family in Westerly, Rhode Island. We have a lot of documentation about his private life until college. He goes to Andover. He goes to Yale. He is expelled his first year at Yale. And that's where all of the like private material and scrapbooks and everything just kind of disappear. So we don't know anything about his life personally from that expulsion from Yale forward. The reasons for the expulsion themselves are a bit murky and unclear.
Because what's captured in the documentation from Yale is improper conduct in relation to a female.
Exactly.
Right? But what does that mean?
Who knows?
Right.
We have no idea if this was a hazing incident, if this was, it doesn't seem to be an assault, because assaults certainly were recorded in those faculty records. It's unclear. And a lot of historians have hung on that one line to claim that Pendleton can never be sort of seriously considered as primarily a gay man, because it seems to be that there was some kind of sexual scandal involving a woman. On the other side, you have a man who, from that point forward, never sustained any relationship publicly that we know of any kind. Certainly, there was no bar to his marrying or even conducting affairs, in those periods. Here's a man who is obsessed with antiques, devoted to his mother, and who destroyed all of his private papers. This is exactly the kind of absence I was talking about at the beginning of the show that to me is an enormous red flag. Had this been just a very secretive heterosexual man, I would still need a lot of explaining to go along with who he was. But to answer your question about sort of how does he merit a museum, he became one of the greatest 19th century collectors of 18th century furniture. And so when he dies in 1904, before his death, he surrenders all of his collection to the Rhode Island School of Design with the caveat that at their museum, they will recreate the house that he'd been living in since 1897. So they would recreate the house, put the rooms together as period rooms. These were the first period rooms in any American museum, and thereby forever memorialize this kind of golden moment of his home and his collection. But as Erica has pointed out earlier, so many of these guys, a lot of it is sort of smoke and mirrors. So as I came to find out in my research, something that even RISD curators were unaware of, he didn't own the house that was being recreated. He was a renter who was probably about an inch away from being evicted, given the fact that, there was something like $50,000 worth of gambling debts on his estate at the end of his life. So does he merit a full museum? I mean, that's a museum wing. That's kind of a question that's still open in some senses. Yes, the collection is extraordinarily valuable, but what it purports to represent, I think in some ways, is not a fully accurate reflection of who he was and what his collection was.
The first thing you see when you walk into the room at the Eustis Estate that's dedicated to Pendleton right now is this almost life-size reproduction of a black and white photo of Pendleton's, I think it's his entry hall, maybe a great hall. Is that in his lived-in home, or is that from the reproduced house at RISD?
So the sort of mural-sized image is of his home. And what is interesting is that if you turn to the right, you see another black and white image of what the space looked like after RISD reinstalled the gallery. And you'll see that RISD stripped away the Turkish rugs. They stripped away a lot of the sort of minor European paintings. They kind of took the aesthetic out of the aesthetic movement home and installed it more as a didactic gallery of American decorative arts. And so the humanity that you glimpse in those pictures of his home the humanity that we cannot find traces of anywhere else because, like Tripp said, we don't have photos of him. We don't have any of his personal letters. You must encounter him through that space that no longer exists, that has been recreated as sort of a stripped down, streamlined version of a person who himself was somewhat of an illusion and a self-construction. So there are layers to that interpretation that I think the gallery teases out quite well. There are moments where if you stand looking at one of the English gilded mirrors, the mirror reflects the black and white image behind it. So it's almost like you're looking into a portal that transports you to his space, which was one of those happy accidents of installation that we did not mean to do. But I think it speaks to the ways that the Pendleton space is the most, in some ways, constructed, but also easily deconstructed space because it lends itself to this larger message of the show about how these men fashion themselves and fashion their homes to put out a certain way of being that was not normal, not normative within their social and economic milieu, which I think speaks to, again, while we don't have conclusive evidence of his sexuality or romantic orientation, the point being made here is that he had the choice to live within the restrictions and confines of society, of finding a wife, raising children. He could have still collected, many of his peers did, like H.F. DuPont down in Delaware, but instead he chose not to. He chose to devote himself singularly to the construction of this collection and of this space that ended up being his legacy in a way that a family might be someone else's legacy. So I think that's why he is part of this grouping of men, who all the three other men, we have more tangible evidence to make some sort of claim or speculate about their romantic or sexual orientation. But with Pendleton, I think he was a mystery even to himself.
And that project the lost in translation kind of sensibility of his private home to the public museum, I think becomes its own kind of visual metaphor for the way that the closet works in some ways, right? So here's this guy with a bit of a murky reputation, given his expulsion from Yale, given his many bankruptcies, given his gambling problem. We haven't gotten into, like, he was an unbelievable, kind of compulsive gambler, and someone who sold antiques that were not always on the up and up. That gets translated to the museum, where instead of, entering the home of a problematic, reclusive, gambling, sort of ne'er-do-well, instead you are entering the generic home of a generic 18th century gentleman. And, it's one of those things of be careful what you wish for, because he wished to be erased personally from his collection. And RISD was only too happy to erase this problematic donor, and instead talk about the collection, and to talk about it in ways that he never would have talked about it himself, as a patriotic reflection of colonial America, which is absolutely not what his aim was.
Well, when you put yourself in that front hall that's reflected in that mural-sized photo in the exhibit, what would you have been surrounded by in Pendleton's actual space before the early RISD curators made it something more wholesome and worthy of being displayed? What were the objects, the colors? What would you find yourself standing among there?
Well, first of all, just standing in that hall would have been a feat in itself. He was so reclusive that just to get there would have been kind of a major feat. But if you'd walked in, and in fact, at one point, we talked about turning that sepia image into a colored image, like sort of having it colorized. It was impossible to try to do. But if you entered that space, you would have seen really sparkling jewel tones of Turkish rugs against dark stained floors. The rugs were very much a part of the collection. Furniture was always his central interest. So the furniture was always of the highest quality. Everything else was kind of a stage prop to the furniture. So these beautiful rugs, kind of B-grade old master paintings that were there for effect. and spectacularly colorful Chinese ceramics that were intended to be used as kind of foils to the mahogany of the tables. So he was an aesthetic movement guy. I mean, in his own way, he was a colorist like Henry Davis Sleeper. He loved juxtaposing colors and was really in it for the beauty of the pieces themselves rather than their provenance or their history. In fact, he, in his will and the sort of inventory that he creates for RISD, he's constantly talking about how beautiful the objects are. And in fact, he's often talking about how handsome the furniture is. I've often seen sort of the Chippendale style as a very sort of stereotypically masculine in the way that it's been interpreted. People talk about the sort of muscular style of the Chippendale. What I loved was in his inventory, he actually makes a Freudian slip at one point and types in, instead of handsome secretary, he writes mansome secretary, which I just loved.
Our fourth bachelor designer is someone who seems like he could not be more different than Pendleton. For all the reclusiveness and privacy of Pendleton, Charlie Gibson is a very public and out there figure. And I'll admit that he's the only one of our four that I was at all familiar with before we started here. When I walked into the room devoted to Charlie Gibson, the first thing that you're greeted with is over the mantelpiece in this room, there are three portraits of Charles that would have hung, I think, sort of in the arrangement they're in the museum over his own mantelpiece in his library at home. So before we get too much into the details of Charlie Gibson's life, what do you think these three portraits were meant to signal to himself and then to visitors in his home?
Well, you're meant to chuckle the minute you say Charlie Gibson's name, because he was an extraordinary character, totally out there. And when he inherits his family's home at 137 Beacon Street, today when people visit the museum, they imagine this kind of seamless connection of, his grandmother building it straight through to the grandson enshrining it as a museum. Those three portraits are something that he adds to the house after he inherits it in his 60s. He had been effectively banned from the house in some ways between 1900 and 1916 after a falling out with his father. His father disinherits him in 1916. He doesn't inherit the house until his mother's death in 1934. And when he comes in, almost immediately his thought is, I want to preserve this house absolutely intact as it had been in his mother's and grandmother's time. But the two significant changes that he makes are, one, he turns his father's bedroom into his writing study. His father loathed the fact that his son was a poet. So this is him sort of shaking his fist from, beyond the grave. But then he goes into his father's library, his father's other favorite room, takes down whatever had been hanging over the mantle. You can assure it was not pictures of Charlie, and installs a picture of me, and then me, and then me. And they're all images of him as this, I know this is an anachronistic term, but he's this hot young man, and he knew it. And the house becomes as much a shrine to his family's elite status as Boston Brahmins as it is a shrine to his own vanished beauty. The house is the picture of Dorian Gray. The house becomes this placing in amber of handsome young Charlie Gibson while he kind of withered away in its rooms.
The house gives the impression of having that same trapped in amber effect that Charlie was trying to achieve with himself and his portraits. But what I didn't realize until going and looking at this exhibit was that there had already been changes to the decor before Charlie took over. So it contains both sort of high Victorian furnishings, then later more aesthetic movement stuff. And maybe a symbol of that, there are two chairs on display in this exhibit that represent the sort of these two eras. Can you talk a little bit about whose chairs they were and how they sort of reflect the changes that may not be highlighted at the Gibson house?
The chairs are a subtle or maybe not so subtle reference to his relationship with his parents. One is his father's favorite chair from his bedroom, and another is the chair that is part of a suite of chairs that his mother received as a wedding present in the 1870s. The reason I put them together is, just as you say, the house did go through a kind of stylistic evolution. It was built in 1859-60, so originally it was very much a mid-Victorian home. Rosamond Gibson, Charlie's mother, lives there as a young bride, And when her mother-in-law dies, in the 1890s, you imagine there is this enormous sigh of relief from Rosamund Gibson that she can finally get her hands on the house. She redecorates it from top to bottom. And her style is much more of the kind of aesthetic movement as opposed to mid-Victorian. As she is redecorating, her husband insists, I am keeping my mid-Victorian bedroom because that is my space. I don't care if you think it's outdated. I'm keeping this chair. So that's the chair that his father insists on keeping. What becomes, the great irony is that chair becomes the center of Charlie Gibson's writing studio. Charlie Gibson, when he moves into the house, and there's this sort of almost kind of like a little bit of a Norman Bates quality to it, he takes his mother's bedroom for his own. So the chair on the right, his mother's aesthetic movement chair, is really about her different taste, his sort of adoption of her role as kind of chatelaine of the house. And I'm glad you brought up this furniture because, Erica, I've often wanted to ask you this question. Did you think, as a curator, that there was a particular challenge with the Gibson gallery in terms of the other galleries have such kind of flashy collections from which to be putting together a really, exciting visual experience? It's a much more subtle story in some ways that we're telling in the Gibson room. Did you find, as a curator, yourself scratching your head thinking, what are we going to put in that room?
I think the challenge with each of the galleries was how do we extract the essence of these homes in the handful of objects that we can fit inside these galleries. And I think with Gibson, you're right, it was a challenge because it is so, when you walk into Gibson House, the home itself is dark. There's not a lot of natural light. It's layered. It's heavy. That's the impression of that mid-19th century furniture, and all that upholstery and all that carpeting. And because it didn't change too much, under Charlie's tenure, it does feel different, stylistically so different from the other three homes, which were, contemporaneous with those men. So the challenge is how do you extract that sense of history? And that's, he hung family registered. He had coats of arms. He was very proud of his lineage, which stretched back to the Warren family of Boston.
I learned from this exhibit that Joseph Warren was descended from William the Conqueror. Who knew?
Maybe.
Right. So, So I think it was, whereas the furniture did a lot of the talking with other galleries, I think what we really relied on with Gibson was, the prints, the books, the hanging works, because he really wanted people who entered his home to know exactly whose home they were walking into, the weight of that history and of that family. So I think that was what we tried to bring out. Having the triptych of his portraits goes a long way to tell you about what his priorities were in addition to the family history, right? As Tripp said, it was about enshrining his own youthful beauty in that house. But it's fascinating. And much like the other men, he constructed an identity for himself, an illusion of a poet and of an author, as much as, he could authentically assert himself as a Boston Brahmin. Other aspects of his life were more fictitious. And that's, I think, what we tried to bring out in the assemblage of objects, including this wonderful contemporary reimagining of Gibson by a contemporary artist who was an artist in residence at Gibson House, which shows all the kind of pokes fun at Gibson, while at the same time staying true to the way that he presented himself in his own lifetime.
Unlike some of the other characters we've talked about, I feel like Charlie Gibson's sexuality was something of an open secret. By 1899, he's kind of basically outed himself in a barely fictionalized version of himself in a novel. You are displaying letters sort of amongst his friends in his social circle from the 1880s, 1890s that are pretty descriptive of his romantic life with men. How do you think he was able to, relatively live pretty openly?
Until this book and project, at least in recent times, the stories of the kind of wide swath that he cut through Boston were really just that. We didn't have much evidence. All there were these sort of rumors that kind of clung to his story, and they have become part of tour legend when you go, on a guided tour through the house. I found no real firm evidence looking at his papers because, once again, you're looking at a giant absence. What I found in the archives was that Ogden Codman filled in a lot of what we don't know. So just as you say, it does appear in the 1890s, and now we have evidence for it, that all of Boston was talking about Charlie Gibson and his affairs. And in fact, Ogden Codman Jr. was trying to bed Charlie Gibson himself. He was in hot pursuit of the then 18-year-old Charlie Gibson. I gave a talk somewhere where somebody said, does it worry you that the 30-something-year-old Codman was talking about an 18-year-old? I said, if you have any idea how many relationships Charlie had already had by the age of 18, you would not be too worried about this young flower. I think it is partly a question of class, both for Codman and for Gibson, that they felt their class shielded them from an awful lot of things. But for Charlie, you do find out that unlike for Codman, he really did take some grueling punishment for his affairs. In terms of, the kind of censure of his social circle, writ large, thinking of sort of Boston society, certainly in terms of his relationship with his father, who disinherits him. And we know from reading Codman's letters that it wasn't just Gibson who was being targeted. It was the whole Gibson family that was being pulled down by these scandals. And in particular, the scandal surrounding what appears to have been the affair of his lifetime, with Maurice de Mony, the self-styled Count de Mony, which appears to have only lasted for a couple of years. And what's fascinating is that it was probably between about 1894 and 1896 when they were together, and all of Boston kind of knew about it. I knew this story just from anecdotes when I went into the Gibson House archives, and in their archives, the only correspondence that still exists between the two men, they are senior citizens writing to each other at the end of their lives and saying, like, remember, when we knew each other in Boston. But of course, they don't really say much. When you go back to Codman's letters, you realize this was a white-hot affair that really sort of scandalized Boston, and I think had real repercussions for him. I mean, Charlie was kind of a pariah for many years until he finally became kind of a lovable caricature at the end of his life.
I feel like the last couple of decades of his life, certainly by the 1930s or maybe a little bit later, he's almost like a mascot of a bygone Brahmin era for Boston. So, people can sort of ignore the rumors and just embrace this sort of almost silly figure of the guy who's dressed in a 40-year-old suit and his top hat and tails going to the Ritz for cocktails. Despite, there are people around the same time. Prescott Townsend is basically a contemporary, maybe a little bit younger than Charlie, and is arrested for being gay right around the same time. So it's, and from a similar social class. So it wasn't a bulletproof armor by any means. How did Charles Gibson use those last couple of decades of reputation as sort of the throwback to a bygone era? How did he leverage that for his own good? Well, I think his age, in some ways, for better or worse, his age kind of desexualized him to the extent that people thought he was just this sort of sweet old man. So there wasn't, the same kinds of things that would have swirled around him as a handsome young man were not present. Exactly so. People began to focus on the really eccentric ways in which he had preserved an 1890s house straight through almost, the 1950s. He dies, in 54. And the way that he preserved that era in his own person as well, wearing, in some ways, partly out of poverty. He's not buying new clothes, partly because he doesn't have the money to do it later on. He's not replacing carpets in the house because he doesn't have the income to do it. He's living at the Hotel Brunswick so that he can avoid heating the house because he can't pay to heat the whole house. In fact, the story of all four of these men, it is I don't know, maybe either a great example or a cautionary tale of you can create a great house despite the fact that you've got nothing in the bank anymore. None of these men had money really much to speak of at the ends of their lives. But Charlie Gibson really embraces this kind of hammy caricature of himself as like an unfrozen Brahmin from the late 19th century. But as early as the 19 teens,
Mayor Curley of Boston thought he was this hilarious figure when he was appointed to being the Parks Commissioner. Mayor Curley, who was, the son of an Irish scrub woman who hated Brahmins, really loved this idea of this clownish figure who represented a class that he was more than happy to say goodbye to in his administration. And yet, to speak to your earlier point about, how was he getting away with things, or how cognizant was he of the dangers of his same-sex relationships? When he was Parks Commissioner, there was a real controversy surrounding, of all things, a public restroom that he wanted to build on the public common. He wanted to build one in the style of Marie Antoinette's music pavilion from Versailles. I mean, forgive me, I can say this is a gay man. How gay is that? I mean, he wants to, create Marie Antoinette's pavilion. But the really telling thing is that he says when the counterclaim comes in, why don't we just make a public restroom in the hotel terrain nearby? And he says, well, people will be more inconvenienced and more exposed to blackmail. And I thought, blackmail? That's a funny thing to say about a public restroom in 1916. But he knew exactly what he was talking about as Parks Commissioner.
I guess he did.
Yeah.
I want to come back to something you mentioned, but maybe we didn't emphasize enough. The idea that Charlie Gibson, from a pretty young age, had this vision of turning the house that he grew up in, the house he eventually inherits from his mother, into a museum. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how he, I guess, if we know how he landed on that idea, but then also what he did to make that into a reality besides, writing labels for everything in the house himself.
Well, I don't know that it's a project of his youth. It certainly eventually enshrines his youth. We have the actual written epiphany in his diary, from 1934, where he suddenly is like, hey, wait, a museum. I could mark up everything. I could turn this whole house into a museum. He's in his 60s at that point.
Okay.
So, and has only recently taken up the house. But a lot of his writing does become effectively inspired by the house. Room guides, labels, these kinds of things. And at one point, he imagines that his house is going to be adopted into the profile of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, SPNEA, which has become the current day Historic New England. And I think people have different takes. Eric, I'll be curious to hear what you have to say. Like, why do you think SPNEA ran for the hills when he offered them the house?
I will say historic New England has had periods of inflation and deflation when it comes to acquiring and deaccessioning house museums. So it might have been that it was too much for us to take on at the time. It's a very sliding door scenario, right? If we had acquired Gibson House Museum, it would have been such a different house museum for us to maintain and operate, where we have very few sort of urban dwellings of that kind in our portfolio. I don't think we have anything comparable to Gibson House right now currently. So our reasonings for saying no are unknown to me, and I would actually be interested in digging into the collection to figure out what if anything, we used as our reasoning. But like I said, it would have been a very different historic New England if we had taken on Gibson House at the time.
Yeah, I think part of it was that they were leery of his project to turn it into a literary shrine to himself. He was not his writing career did not, let us just say, sort of translate directly into a literary shrine. He was sort of not writing at that level. And I think, also, I don't think that historic New England was uninterested in the Victorian period per se, but from some of the letters that were exchanged, you got this sense that they thought that they could get something better. They thought that, it wasn't top drawer Victorian.
Right. I think too, this is the 30s. I think it's so funny now today we look back on the vanishing historic footprint of Back Bay and we think to ourselves, God, all of these homes, a lot of these interiors have been absolutely gutted by developers, even as the historic facade is maintained. But in the 30s, I don't know if we had that perspective just yet. I think, maybe the trustees thought that these homes would continue on to be preserved into the future, and that historic New England did not need to necessarily step in right then. But I also think, Tripp, to your point, right? I mean, it wasn't, the stories we wanted to tell in the 30s were very much rooted in the colonial revival narrative of, 18th century, 17th century homes, preserving the architecture and material footprint. And perhaps Gibson House Museum was too recent a home for us to really commit to at the time. Although now you see, again, it stands today as a house museum to really preserve the historical memory of that kind of architecture and that kind of design. So thank God it does remain a museum, because everything else around it is vanishing.
Yeah, and I think in the 30s, they were probably imagining that Back Bay was in its twilight and good riddance. There was this feeling that, like, why preserve what, nobody really wants? They didn't know.
I was just trying to do the mental math. That's probably the time equivalent of saying today, we should preserve this, 50s ranch home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who cares? Just, just another suburban tract home with a 50s ranch house. It's normal.
Right.
Well, it's a good thing then that now all four of the houses we've talked about are house museums open to the public. Can you remind listeners where each of these four properties are and how people could get some information about how to visit them if they want to?
Well, I'll speak to the two historic New England properties. So, Codman Estate is in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It is open seasonally from June through October, and you can go on our website at historicnewengland.org to learn more about visiting hours. Beauport, the Sleeper McCann House, is in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and similarly open, I think, more days a week than Codman Estate is, but you can also find that information online. I know that RISD Museum is open, I think, 7 days a week, so the Pendleton galleries can be viewed there. And Gibson House Museum is also open seasonally. I think actually it's open year round.
It is open year round.
And it is a house museum in Boston's Back Bay.
A strange aspect for listeners to wrap their heads around is that we're talking about these, the four owners and designers of these wonderful properties, but then the exhibit pulling them all together is at a fifth historic property. So if people want to see or want to visit the exhibit for the importance of being furnished, where and how do they do that?
The exhibit is housed at the Eustis Estate in Milton, Massachusetts. The Eustis Estate is itself an aesthetic movement home built in the 1870s. And so it is a great venue to encounter these four men and their homes, because it's wrapped in this beautiful aesthetic movement package. The exhibit is open through October 27th, and Eustis Estate is open Friday to Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.
This is probably the first time that the Eustis Estate has had to have a nudity warning at the door to any of their exhibition galleries. So this is a fun exhibit to go and see. Before I wrap up, is there anything that you wish I'd asked you about these four men?
Well, I guess the only thing that I would say, and that I often say before like kind of public gallery tours, is that because their four approaches are so different, it is really intentional that every gallery you go into is meant to feel like its own little world. And it's its own little world in the sense that it's a mini biography of a person and of a house, but it is also, in the way that all biographies are, a connection of their public and private lives. If someone were expecting just an exhibition about these men as tastemakers or as stylists, I think they'll be surprised that what they're going to encounter is that plus, I think, as layered a look as we have been able to give you about who they were as whole men.
With that in mind, if people want to learn more, if they want to follow you or some of your work online, where would you steer people?
They can purchase the accompanying book, The Importance of Being Furnished, for Bachelors at Home, published by Rowman and Littlefield, came out in 2024. You can purchase that at any of your favorite independent bookstores or online.
Well, I'll just say, if you enjoy the exhibition, we highly encourage you to make an appointment to visit Codman Estate and Beauport. And there are other house museums in our portfolio where we tell the stories of men and women who had same-sex partnerships and relationships. And we are committed to bringing those stories to life and being truthful and inclusive and transparent in our storytelling. So, this can be considered just one one stop on your overall tour to learn more about the breadth and depth of history in New England through our beautiful 38 homes.
And actually, to that point, Erica, let me plug the program, the virtual program that Historic New England will be doing, which I'll be moderating on September 17th. It's called A Museum of Her Own, and it's going to put together a panel of experts and curators talking about the single woman's home. So looking at the Sarah Orne Jewett House, Hamilton House in South Berwick, Maine, and the Alice Austin House on Staten Island. So in some ways to provide a deeper idea than just an image of sort of bachelor homes in this period. We tried not to call it the bachelorette home, but all of these are public museums as well, homes that were created by single women.
Well, I will make sure I link to all of that in the show notes this week. Erica and Tripp, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To learn more about the importance of being furnished and the 4 designers that we discussed today, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/308. We'll have a link to all the details of the importance of being furnished at the Eustace Estate and how to visit. The Eustace Estate in Milton is open Friday through Sunday, and the importance of being furnished will be on view there through October 27th. I'll also link to information about Historic New England's 38 historic house museums around the region, and Tripp's upcoming talk on September 17th titled A Museum of Her Own, plus his other upcoming talks and tours. And of course, we'll have an affiliate link where you can support the show and local bookstores when you purchase Tripp Evans' book, The Importance of Being Furnished, for Bachelors at Home. If you want to leave us some feedback, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We are Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and still most active on Twitter. If you're on Mastodon, you can find me as @hubhistory@better.boston. But I'm not very good about posting there. Or for simplicity's sake, just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. We're in all your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, and now YouTube to replace the now retired Google Podcasts. Don't get too excited though, it's just a static image while the audio podcast plays. You could also listen on your favorite smart speaker. If you have an Amazon Echo, just say, Alexa, play the Hub History podcast. Or if you have a Google Home, you can say,
Hey Google, play the Hub History podcast.
Sure, playing the latest episode of Hub History, our favorite stories from Boston history.
Apple Podcasts is still by far the most popular podcast app. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider reviewing the show. If you do, drop me a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker with our new logo as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.